Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we are closing out our look at the Roger Moore Bond era, which means we're talking about A View to a Kill. A View to a Kill is a film that is somewhat controversial in the Bond fan community. Certainly, it's not beloved. It's often ranked as one of the worst Bond adventures. However, I think it has some fine aspects. Having already declared For Your Eyes Only to be the weakest of the Roger Moore Bond films, I feel obligated to explain why I might rank a film like A View to a Kill higher, if only marginally, than something like For Your Eyes Only. After all, many of you politely disagreed with my assessment of For Your Eyes Only, even if you conceded my analysis on certain points. And so let me just get the obvious thing out of the way. A View to a Kill is in many ways a less competently made film than For Your Eyes Only. For Your Eyes Only has a more intelligently composed screenplay, if nothing else. But for me, in my subjective estimation, and all of our estimations of Bond films are subjective, and that, I think, is to be celebrated, if only because we, as Bond fans, have a radically different relationship to these movies than most people. I mean, how you feel about a movie you've seen, more than 10 times over the course of your lifespan is going to be radically different than the way someone who is seeing that movie for the first time feels about it. And that's a difference to be celebrated because both people are coming at it from valid, if different, perspectives. And of course, I'm bringing my experience to the table here, my own values. A View to a Kill has a level of color and imagination and strangeness about it that For Your Eyes Only does not. One thing I have stressed in my reviews thus far that you, if you've been following the series, you may or may not pick up on, is that for me, a lot of the appeal of the Bond movie is not just in its fantastical nature. It's not necessarily how grandiose it is, though I do like some of the grandiose Bond films very much. It is more about the level of peculiarity about it. I think what made the Ian Fleming Bond adventures so striking is the way that he populates those adventures, which are very simple stories in a lot of ways, with such memorable images and set pieces and characters. His memorable villains, his memorable allies, and the way Bond is interacting and navigating those relationships in his stories is often very interesting, even when the stories are fairly lightweight and thin. The Bond films, for me, are also at their best when they do that. And the Roger Moore era has many films that are somewhat objectively a little bit uneven, to the extent that we can have an objective assessment of these movies, but have a lot of color in them, like The Man with the Golden Gun, a film that is somewhat lumpy. I had my fair share of criticism for it in my look at The Man with the Golden Gun, but it has such striking images and striking characters that it rises above many of the other films in the series for me, just because it has that to hold on to. And I think when we look at what we might call the John Glenn era of Bond films, which began with For Your Eyes Only and will continue up through License to Kill, you enter a period where the Bond films are rigorously workmanlike, in a way that they hadn't really been before. Don't get me wrong, it's always been a franchise where it's kind of what you might call a journeyman franchise. And I don't mean that in any negative sense. I actually mean that in the best sense. But it meant that a lot of the people working on these films were essentially craftsmen as opposed to, visionaries that came to really just do their craft as well as they could. And so directors like Terrence Young, Guy Hamilton, Lewis Gilbert, these are not the pantheon of the most visionary filmmakers, but they understood their craft. They understood how to stage a scene and elicit something interesting in that scene. And you see a lot of really dependable, sturdy craftsmanship in the Bond movies. John Glenn's approach to the Bond films is even more rigorously focused on that craftsmanship, because we lose, once you hit For Your Eyes Only for a while, this sort of grandiose elegance that you kind of took for granted in a lot of the Bond films that came before it. This sort of sweep, whether it was the sort of Hitchcockian elegance of the early Terrence Young films, or the more playful cartoonishness of Guy Hamilton, or the grand sweep of the Lewis Gilbert films. A lot of that texture is a lot of the meat of those movies. The Bond films are not just their stories or characters. They are the stuff that kind of fills the gaps between them. The reason people fall in love with the Bond series is really it's ambiance. It's kind of intangible spiritual essence, so to speak. There's something there. They captured lightning in a bottle with this universe, and there's something there that just holds an allure, that stew of death and violence and romance and desire and luxury all together in these fantastical locales. There's something really primal about it. And these films in the 1980s have some of that energy, but it's less in the visual texture of these movies in the way that it was previously. We lost a lot of the big talents that had driven that sort of visual atmosphere in the Bond films previously. Ken Adam, notably, the sort of the cinematography during the 80s, for whatever reason, is not among the heights of the series. Even when these movies are very handsomely filmed, it's a little bit more sturdy than sort of like the grandiose panoramas of The Spy Who Loved Me. And that puts a little bit more focus on the elements in the movies to kind of carry the weight of that sort of color and scope. And when I complain about a film like For Your Eyes Only just feeling a little, I don't know, dreary or run-of-the-mill, it's that those characters in an otherwise relatively restrained movie don't feel big enough to kind of capture that energy. And A View to a Kill, for all of its sloppiness and laziness, has some very big characters in it. And mainly, I'm talking about Christopher Walken's Max Zorin and Grace Jones's Mayday, who are really just wonderful villains, both of them. So peculiar in their relationship, so interestingly magnetic in their screen presence. There's nobody else like these two personalities. And Christopher Walken, for all of his great performances over the years, when you watch View to a Kill, he is so engaged in this role that he's a delight to watch. And Grace Jones, one of the great, magnetic presences of her time, just owns the screen whenever she's on it. And so I think that is enough in many ways to tip the scale in A View to a Kill's favor for me. In addition to the fact that the movie has, set pieces set at the Eiffel Tower as well as the Golden Gate Bridge. That's a level of, instant, vivid memorability that is distinct to A View to a Kill. In some ways, it kind of goes to if you compare the posters of A View to a Kill to For Your Eyes Only, For Your Eyes Only has a great movie poster, but the imagery that they're just able to pull right out of A View to a Kill for its poster campaign just speaks to the way that they really have, like, keyed into some very powerful imagery here, whether it's Bond dangling on the side of the Eiffel Tower or going back to back with the very intimidating Grace Jones. So, having digressed a little bit there in the opening 10 minutes of this video, let's just get into the meat of it with A View to a Kill. Because A View to a Kill gets off to what I think is a little bit of a weak start. I think the pre-title sequence of A View to a Kill is one of the weakest in the series, in the sense that it's just very ho-hum. If Octopussy had this sort of prototypical Bond title sequence done to a very high level with such great stunt work, such a great energy and momentum about it, there's just not a really great hook for the opening sequence of A View to a Kill. You could feel that they really didn't have a strong idea for it. It's kind of almost replaying the snow sequence from The Spy Who Loved Me, but to much lesser effect. The Spy Who Loved Me climaxes with one of the most iconic stunts of the series when it closes its pre-title sequence. And here, you know, you get some good stunt work, but it's kind of undercut a little bit by one of the worst, most egregious gags in the Roger Moore era. Usually the comedy moments in Roger Moore's Bond films kind of stand unto themselves. The Beach Boys call out in A View to a Kill recalls the fairly ill-advised slide whistle moment from The Man with the Golden Gun, which kind of sabotaged that wonderful car flip stunt. And here you have, like, if you just mute the film and watch the stunt work is pretty exciting. But that Beach Boys cue just sucks all the life out of that pre-title sequence. Even when sandwiched on the other side of it, you have some of the best John Barry music. He's revisiting, in some ways, his march from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, creating a new version of it for the 1980s with wailing guitar. That track is just instantly exciting, as is the main title anthem when that gets used. This actually has a pretty strong John Barry score, but that moment just kind of throws it off, and then the way it kind of closes out doesn't quite feel right either. And one of the bigger problems with A View to a Kill on the whole is that Roger Moore's age is the elephant in the room. I don't think Roger Moore was too old to play James Bond, but I don't think A View to a Kill handles that as well as Octopussy did. Octopussy gives us a more mature Bond, and it feels like they're presenting us a more mature James Bond, an older gentleman who's really settled into himself. Whereas in this film, it really doesn't feel like they've understood that dynamic in the same way. They're not putting him against somebody who can really hold their own against Roger Moore the way Maude Adams could. And it's in fact, you know, Stacey is perhaps the weakest Bond girl in the series from a dramatic perspective. She just doesn't really hold the plot in any way, shape, or form in terms of bringing momentum to it. She doesn't create an interesting relationship with Roger Moore. There's just she just feels like a lot of filler when she's in the scene she's in. And, you know, I don't blame anybody other than the director and producers for the way they've kind of directed that and staged the scenes in which she's in, because it's just, they could have cast someone differently, or they could have directed this character differently, and it just doesn't feel right in the context of this movie. And so Roger Moore himself, who always is giving 110%, even he feels a little bit off here, and I think this is one of the big casualties of these movies as they've been upgraded in quality over the years. In the era of, you know, 4K televisions and upscaled Blu-rays, it's now easier than ever in close-ups of actors to see every, freckle on their face. And in this film, Roger Moore had some work done and has a kind of surprised expression on his face, and it just doesn't. It puts him in the uncanny valley a little bit, and it's unfortunate too because that just has a way of emphasizing rather than de-emphasizing his age, and I think that's unfortunate because otherwise Roger Moore is having a lot of fun here. I really love how we actually kind of see a little bit of the return of aspects of the callous Bond of the first two Roger Moore adventures, in the sense that when his contact is killed in the Eiffel Tower, Bond is very curt and careless about his death, when he just kind of moves on with the hunt for Mayday with that one-liner about a fly in his soup. That's kind of like a nice little callous touch, and then you really get this sort of I don't know, there's kind of like a little bit of the return of his kind of playful meanness a little bit with his relationship with Tippett when he's pretending to be a horse buyer at Zorin's estate, which is actually, I think that stretch of this movie is actually really rather fun. It's wonderful to see him interacting with effectively the great John Steed, another one of the great British spy characters. The title sequence happens, which I actually think the title sequence is a hoot. This sort of black light, neon glow texture set to what is one of the best Bond songs. Duran Duran's "View to a Kill" just works like gangbusters. It's one of the best up-tempo Bond songs for sure, and just has such wonderful bite to it. The title sequence is not objectively, or I should say objectively or subjectively, really one of the best of them, but it has such fun quality because it's so of its era. There is kind of always a beauty in the Bond films being time capsules, and that title sequence very much feels like a time capsule of a moment in time for the 1980s that I really appreciate. But it does kind of cue you into the generally sort of along with the use of the Beach Boys in the pre-title sequence and some of the other things, that this is kind of a little bit of a tackier feeling Roger Moore Bond movie. It's actually really interesting how, despite having so much of the same production team, writing team, and the same director, how different the 1980s Bond movies feel from one another. When you go from For Your Eyes Only to Octopussy to this, to The Living Daylights to License to Kill, they all really have a fairly distinct texture and feel. And this one, I don't know, it kind of continues from Octopussy a little bit, but it really has its own sort of heightened feeling, and it feels a lot more, for better and I mean mostly worse, very 1980s in a way that even Octopussy did not. And that has some enjoyable aspects too, but it also just means, in general, Bond is not looking his best in this movie relative to some of the other entries in the Roger Moore era, as he's kind of leaned into that 1980s vibe a bit. But, after that pre-title sequence, I think the story setup for A View to a Kill is kind of fun. I like the use of the horse race, the kind of setup of Zorin and Mayday. We're not sure about her. That sort of build up there, and then this centering this whole introduction around Zorin essentially, cheating in horse racing. Feels like a very classic sort of Fleming idea. This villains being cheats is an idea that Fleming establishes very strongly, and this idea that Bond is kind of slowly digging his way into this as he's uncovering exactly what Zorin wants to do with the microchips works for me pretty well, as he, Patrick McNee being a sort of comic relief. I mean, as with the rest of the movie, the fight scenes during this section of the movie are kind of a little bit so-so, but I appreciate the sort of slow burn, one location setup here, with Bond just kind of getting a lay of the land, understanding who the characters are, and trying to maintain his cover as best he can. This is also a sequence that gives us one of the more ominous visuals in the movie, which is when is the murder in the car wash, which almost has like a horror movie element. And as I've discussed before, I kind of like those bits in the Bond movie where they kind of jump over into horror movie language a little bit, as they did, for example, in like Moonraker when Corinne's chased by the dogs. The sort of weird hallucinatory nature of these deaths really feels like they're part of the Bond DNA. But I realize now as I get into this, I've kind of jumped ahead and skipped over the Paris sequence, which the fact that I skipped over it may speak to some level of how memorable it is, though I think there's some... I've never forgotten the butterfly dancer, which kind of stuck in my mind even when I was a kid. I think the one virtue of the Paris sequence, which is mostly filler, it's like we need an action sequence in the movie, is that it is very like, it's very silly. The French guy going like, "Oh my car!" It's just it's very hokey, but the stunt work has that wonderful tactile charm that you don't see in movies in the same way anymore. Some of the stunt work in that is really actually pretty impressive and elaborate in terms of the level of coordination they had to do to capture some of those stunts. So as much as it's fairly comic in its approach, you have to give credit for the wonderful legacy of the Bond stunt team. And I as much as the Bond films of today have some really great stunt work, there's just something to be said for the true, craft that was on display during this time, especially when you had less ability to kind of paper over the seams. You had to really do this stuff for real. You couldn't just CG in backgrounds around whatever you were doing at any time. So, that said, the whole setup for this story is a bit flimsy, right? It's essentially, Zorin's plot is essentially a retread of the Goldfinger plot. And in many ways, it feels pretty unmotivated for who Max Zorin is as a character. He's got a fairly interesting background. He's essentially like a genetic oddity that's been kind of engineered and has worked with the KGB for a while. That whole background is actually pretty interesting, as is his, obsession with rigging the game in his favor. And in some ways, his plan for Silicon Valley is yet another example of him rigging the game in his favor, but it does feel a little bit superimposed on the character. Nothing about the character feels especially tied to the world of technology. In many ways, he feels just more of an archetype of a exuberant 1980s businessman stereotype gone like aggressively sinister. And I think that's one reason Christopher Walken's off-kilter energy plays so well with this character. He pivots from manic to threatening to kind of just like goofy, honestly, sometimes within the same sentence. And it's a delight to watch. I think it's interesting with Max Zorin that he actually gets to do some of the most violent behavior any of the Bond villains gets. Like when he's mowing down all the people that helped him with Operation Main Strike in the mine at the, towards the climax of the movie. The movie really draws that out, and the brutality of that. And he is just having the time of his life doing it. And it's really quite chilling, and it feels very consistent with the character we've seen thus far. This is a character who is a truly malevolent, cruel person. And, it's interesting how many of the series' best villains fall in the Roger Moore era. I think Zorin stands there. You have Kamal Khan. You have, I think, Drax is in the running. Scaramanga is obviously a favorite. I think Kananga is even really one of the better villains in the series. And part of that is just how many films Roger Moore did. When you do as many films as Roger Moore did, you have more shots to really nail it. But I think this was a particular era where a lot of really good actors got to flex as villains. And it's one of the aspects that, again, makes this movie work. And speaking of villains, I want to circle back to Mayday here, because Mayday's sacrificial death is, for me, one of the highlights of the entire series. It is a moment that does what only rare moments do in the Bond movies, which is achieves a level of kind of resonance and pathos that you don't often find in a Bond movie, especially with a character as absurd as Mayday. She is more of an image than a character, a presence, really, wearing such dramatic fashions with Grace Jones' stoic appearance. But something in the pivot for the story, the way that character takes such a tragic turn with her betrayal at the hands of Zorin, the way she is, her close friends are just kind of killed by Zorin as, collateral damage as he cleans up his scheme. The emotional intensity with which Mayday responds to that is atypical for the series. And again, we don't have a lot of instances in the series where a character is betrayed in this way and then assists Bond. But for a moment, she almost becomes the driving force. Bond is a little bit more passive in this section of the movie where he's trying to figure out how to defuse the bomb. She is the one pushing him to action. And it's really on her shoulders that the plot is averted. She's the one who lowers Bond down to the bomb, who brings Bond back up again when under her own strength. And then in a wonderfully and unexpectedly powerful send-off, sacrifices herself against Bond's protest, bringing the bomb defiantly out where Zorin can see it to explode far away from where it would do any damage. And there's just a brief moment that I think is just so dramatically powerful for the Bond films. And that is when Grace Jones' face changes over from cackling, manic laughter, just defiant laughter knowing that she's going to her death, to a sudden look of just chilling resignation as the moment of her death comes. It is really stunningly heightened cinema, and it's everything I watch the movies for. It's one of those larger-than-life moments that captures, in an otherwise very absurd story, a really powerful expression of a character confronting death. And it's all the credit to Grace Jones for really selling that moment the way she does. As far as the way Bond behaves in this movie, he's a much more I don't know. He's definitely playing the role of the detective as he has in many of the stories thus far. I mean, the 1980s particularly leans into Bond's detective aspects. When you get to the Timothy Dalton era with the Living Daylights, it is really about Bond, getting into the nitty-gritty of investigating and interrogating people and kind of playing them off of each other. And this one feels a little bit more like, I said off the cuff that, For Your Eyes Only was the Columbo episode of James Bond movies. If that was the Columbo episode of James Bond movies, this is like the Columbo knockoff episode of James Bond movies in some ways, in the way that Bond is such a jokey investigator. I think the bit where he introduces himself as James Bond to the cop is just Roger Moore kind of leaning into the absurdity of the moment and the goofiness of the moment. And you have to give credit to Roger Moore for really just knowing how to sell a comedic moment. But I think this movie generally undersells Bond's capacity for charm. One of the virtues I said in Octopussy was that there is so much opportunity for Bond to be charming and intelligent, and we don't get as much of that here. You get some really good play with Zorin and Mayday, but in many ways Bond just feels kind of like along for the ride here. He's doing investigation, but it just feels like every investigation step that he's doing is just kind of like handed to him a little bit. It's just kind of accidental. He's following the trail, but he's just kind of stumbling upon the next piece, and it's not as exciting because Bond doesn't really feel like he's driving the action. And so as much as I've praised the fact that, the way Mayday's end is handled, there's a real sense in which the whole movie feels a little bit like that, with other characters kind of being the real driving force in the story, and Bond just kind of carrying on a little bit behind the rest of them. And I think that's another reason this feels like a slightly unsatisfying send-off for Roger Moore's Bond. It just doesn't play to Roger Moore's strengths. It's not giving him as much room to shine. The dialogue is not as sharp as it was in Octopussy. He's doing his best, but I feel like in many ways the Bond characterization in this movie almost feels like a slight afterthought, as though they had gotten so complacent with Roger Moore's Bond that they didn't really feel like they had to be creative in the way they employed him. And I think that's unfortunate. Roger Moore definitely deserved a better send-off than this, but he had so many great moments along the way. I am an unabashed Roger Moore Bond fan. I would say my favorite Bonds are Timothy Dalton and Roger Moore, and those are two polar ends of the spectrum, so you can see that my taste gravitates towards extremes, you might say. So, I've talked here long enough. I try to keep these videos around 30 minutes for the sake of all involved. But let me know in the comments what you think about A View to a Kill. I have a feeling I already know how many of you feel about this movie, but in particular, let me know what aspects of this movie do work for you. And I look forward to catching you in future videos. I don't know if I'm going to jump right into On Her Majesty's Secret Service and continue the series, or whether I'm going to focus on something else for a little bit. So we'll see what's next, but I will definitely be catching you in the next one.